The Institute for Economic Justice says the proposed family grant will exclude millions of hungry people. Government is apparently hoping to replace the 350 Rand Covid-19 grant with a job-seeker, caregiver and/or household grant. Now, the Institute says the proposal would have devastating implications and should be stopped. For more on this now, I'm joined by Zimbali Mncube, who is the Budget and Tax Justice Researcher at the IEJ, and he joins us virtually from here in Johannesburg. Zimbali, thank you so much for your time this evening. Quite an in-depth press statement sent out by the Institute for Economic Justice. Now, it does seem that it all stems from a set of proposals, or apparent set of proposals, that have now your organization and others in your sphere have been able to lay eyes on, apparently from Treasury and the Presidency, that really it seems those in your organization have really put their hands up in frustration and probably fear as well, because you can see a truck coming heading towards the people who really have been through the most over the last few years. What have you seen in those sets of proposals, firstly, with that first grant, that you believe is going to be a major issue if it ever comes to fruition?
Thank you for having me. So essentially, the focus of our memo and statement that we sent today was the proposal which seeks to slash the SRD grant, the current beneficiaries of the SRD grant, to approximately 10.6 million into 3 different groups. And one of these groups which you are referring to is the extreme poor, which are around 4.6 million, right? And these are people that the proposals identifies as people who cannot access work and have less than matric, and therefore would receive a household grant, which is still at the value of 350. Now, our criticism to this type of a grant is that there is currently no structure or a way to identify a household in South Africa. We know that households are porous, with people living with different family members. In addition to that, it's simply unacceptable for people in a household with more than one unemployment person splitting 350 amongst themselves in the context of high inequality and increased food prices and fuel prices.
This also sounds extremely complicated, Zimbali, because if you look at the setup for the SRD grant, that was supposed to be pretty straightforward. And even then, there were major complications that really held up the payment of the SRD grant, even in its various tranches. Do you have any faith that such a complex set of rules set up for this new iteration would be able to be processed by government as it stands?
Not at all, not at all. If we are to learn anything from the rollout of the SRD grant, is that in its initial introduction, we saw that there was a large uptake, about 15 million applications, and about 10.5 million payments at some point. However, as we progressed, especially in the last few months, when the threshold was decreased to 350 and new questions and complex application criteria was introduced, less and less people started applying for the grant and receiving the grant. And so what this is showing us is that the more targeted and the more stringent qualification criteria are being put in place, the more people will be less likely to receive the grant. And so what this proposal seeks to do, splitting this cohort of potential beneficiaries into 3 different groups, will further create barriers, because it seeks to identify, or it seeks to link people with job-seeking conditionalities. And it's not quite clear how the government will prove that people are looking for jobs. But over and above that, we know that South Africa is struggling from an issue of structural unemployment. And so to assume that there are jobs available for people to simply jump into is quite incorrect.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because according to your statement today, it seems to draw on the fact that these proposals focus largely on a 2021 World Bank proposal for replacing the SRD grant with what they call a job seekers grant. So there seems to be a big focus on these new proposals on active job seekers. And like you've just explained at the end there, that's a very complex term in the South African context, isn't it? Firstly, we're not creating enough jobs even for the amount of graduates, let alone people who haven't been able to get an extra qualification. And we also know there's a large number of young people who've given up seeking jobs because it's too expensive, because there aren't enough jobs to apply for, and the list goes on. And then through COVID, we saw a lot of people giving up their jobs because they needed to give care at home. Or now lately, we're hearing people giving up their jobs because they cannot afford transport fees. So it's far more complex than just taking a explanation for a term like active job seekers from a working document from the World Bank.
Exactly. And I think another important point to add there is that it divides, ignoring the factors that you've mentioned, it divides people according to those who are undeserving, who are simply are said to not bothering looking for work. And it divides them into those who are undeserving and those who are deserving, who are reportedly looking for jobs. And so from a moral perspective as well, it fails to appreciate the reasons and the barriers, like you've mentioned, that are an obstacle to job seeking. I mean, Youth Capital released a study that estimated job cost to be about 930. And so in that context, it's quite clear that if there are people, about 13.8 million people living below the food poverty line of 624, it's quite hard for anyone in this context to look for employment.
In this new set of proposals, there's also talk of a household grant and then also a highly limited version of a possible caregivers grant. Can you explain to us what that seems to mean in the current context?
Yes, and so when I started off, I explained the first group. As I said, the group of 10.6 million beneficiaries being split into three. And so the first group that is said to be extremely poor would receive a household grant of 350. And then there's then a middle group of about 4.1 million people that would get the job seekers grant. And then the last group, which is about 3.8 million people, would be linked to active work seeking and so on. It's not quite clear what that means. But essentially, in this context, as we read this proposal, it means that those who need the grant the most, which is people that are living in extreme poverty, will be simply reduced to sharing a household grant, whilst those who are, according to the proposal, identified as the middle group and are able to look for jobs will be receiving a job seekers grant. And so those are the two proposals. And then there's also a caregivers grant, but it's quite limited in that it proposes to only limit the caregivers grant to parents who have children under the age of 2 years old. And so that also has regressive implications because it ignores the unpaid care work that is undertaken largely by women and Black women in this country. And so simply saying that those who have children older than the age of 2 should look for jobs in the labor market ignores, the unpaid care work that women take on.
Absolutely. One final question before I let you go, Zimbali. All of this now coming out against the backdrop of what really should have been a conversation around when, not if, but when the basic income grant would be put in place. And I do believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that the presidency was supposed to meet with a civil society coalition earlier this year to talk about what the next steps would be. And that hasn't happened as yet. And now we've got this. It must all be very frustrating for those working in this very important sphere, like you and your colleagues.
Indeed, it's quite frustrating and discouraging because the relationship that we want to have with government is one of collaboration, trying to ensure that we find solutions, progressive solutions to alleviate hunger, poverty, and inequality. And so, from time to time, we are found being in a confrontational relationship, and so it's disappointing because earlier on in January, when we met with the president, there was a commitment to meet at a follow-up meeting by June to ensure that we present a sustainable way forward in the form of how we can get to a universal basic income grant. So we presented in the initial meeting some pathways of how we can get there. And so this follow-up meeting was meant to solidify that path with the different stakeholders in government. But seemingly, National Treasury is the major barrier to ensuring that we find a sustainable solution forward. And so we are still calling on the presidency to intervene and find a political solution to this challenge, because what is happening in government is that whilst the DSD is sympathetic to some of our proposals, Treasury, through some of these proposals we've been talking about, seeks to limit the grant, and it seeks to impose austerity budgeting, which is essentially cutting expenditure towards public services and social grants and important measures to support income like the UBIG.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Very important work being done there, and we wish you all the best. That's Zimbali Mncube from the Institute for Economic Development. He is the Budget and Tax Justice Researcher there. We thank him for his time this evening.